Welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming today, those of you in person, but also those of you online, to help celebrate the annual IHR Book Award with the winner and the nominees. Each year, the IHR awards Best Book of the Year, which is determined by a committee of several expert reviewers. For this award, the reviewers include Leslie Alexander, Ron Broglio, Lois Brown, Serena Ferrando, Karen Koo, Alana Luna, Andrew Mara, Maura Riley and Mike Chula. And I want to take this opportunity to thank them for their expertise and their hard work of reading and assessing the books while teaching and doing their own research. They are the embodiment of a wonderful level of commitment, collegiality and professionalism. Thank you. As many as you may know, on alternative years, the IHR moves between awarding an international, national and internal book award. And it is the latter that we are celebrating here today. These awards are a way of acknowledging the innovative scholarship that we all do in our fields of research. And to that end, and therefore, before I introduce the winner, I want to hand over briefly to Ron Broglio to announce the shortlist candidates. Thanks, Ron.
All right, thank you, Nicole. So the list of shortlist of candidates are reflective of the range of fields in the humanities. It's actually quite amazing to see the variety of work that comes in and to celebrate the variety of scholarship here at ASU. So briefly, the list is Beyond Hashtags, Racial Politics, and Digital and Black Digital Networks by Sarah Florini. And this looked at the variety of networks, particularly in the 2000s and 2010s, that were developing online, the Black digital networks. And that really had a resonance for work being done today. Colonial Legacies in Chicano Literature and Culture by Vanessa Fonseca Chavez. And this looked at the influence of the Spanish in New Mexico, in the Southwest, particularly in New Mexico, and the contentious imperialism of the Spanish in relationship to Latina and Latino cultures. Then Psychomotor Aesthetics, Movement and Affect in Modern Literature and Film by Anna Hedberg Olenilia, and who's here. Thank you for attending. And this was an incredible look, particularly a modernist, like phenomenological development, neurodevelopment and phenomenological development, both in Europe and its effects and cross influences with Russia in literature, film, and culture. And then Women, Sex, and Madness, Notes from the Edge by Brianne Foss, and this looked at women's desire and the constitutions of desire, as well as the prohibitions and limitations and impositions on that desire. So you can see throughout these the variety of types of scholarship that resonate with concerns today. We're proud of all of them. But then we have the award winner, which Nicole will announce.
So the calibre of the humanities research that Ron just mentioned, I hope is very evident. But in the end, there can only be one winner, and it was Hannah Barker for her book, The Most Precious Merchandise, The Mediterranean Trade in Black Sea Slaves, 1260 to 1500. So let me give you some reasons why the committee voted that Most Precious Merchandise Book of the Year. It was assessed as bringing to life the history of the slave trade in ways that make comparisons and parallels between medieval slavery and the enslavement of Africans that would come to dominate in Americas centuries later. It looks at the way in which women and children were treated and complicates this, noting that sexual abuse in the Mediterranean never became the breeding mentality that came to dominate the United States. Consequently, the book combined interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches and methods from race studies, medieval history, art history to archival methodologies. The book looks at the past through the lens of the present and vice versa to demonstrate the way in which slavery is not and was not a non-monolithic idea. Richard Amesbury, the director of the School of Historical, Philosophical and Religious Studies, said this about Hannah Barker's book. Dr. Barker's work is important because it sheds light on how race was understood in parts of Europe during the Middle Ages and how these categories functioned in economies of slavery. Calling attention to both differences and similarities with contemporary concepts of race, her research challenges the historiography of this legally constructed and contested identity marker. While a colleague, Leslie Alexander, says this, Hannah Barker's brilliant study is a fascinating journey into the nature of slavery in the Mediterranean during the medieval period. It is meticulous in its research and analysis and has timely relevance in the modern era. Barker challenges us to shed our modern understandings about slavery and to understand enslavement in the medieval period on its own terms. I won't read all the reviews, which are absolutely outstanding, but I want to add that the encouragement of interdisciplinarity in the humanities at ASU has clearly enabled such an innovative methodological approach that Hannah Barker's book embodies. Her approach then is testament to how to engage in wider academic audience to provide significant impact in a particular field of research. Hannah, thank you so much, and please accept this award on behalf of the IHR and the committee. Congratulations.
Turn my sound on. Okay. So I want to start by briefly just thanking everyone who came to celebrate today in person and online. Thank you for coming. And I also want to thank Nicole and the IHR for giving us the opportunity to have this kind of occasion and for organizing everything. I really appreciate it. So I want to start my talk today by telling a story. This is a story that I've returned to over and over again in the research and writing process, and every time I come back to it, I see something new. So I'm going to start with this story, and I'm going to use it as a framing device to explain where this project came from, how it came together into a book, and where I think it might go next. This story is unusual because we have very few first-person slave narratives from the medieval period, but this is one of those few. Technically, it wasn't written down by an enslaved person. What survives is the legal testimony that was given by an enslaved person in support of their petition for freedom. And it was actually physically written down by a notary who was working on behalf of the court. So that means that there are some issues surrounding the language. The enslaved person was probably speaking some dialect of Italian, but their statements were written down in Latin. And the notary might have incorporated other changes in the process of translation. So it's still an interesting source despite these complications, and this is what it says. In your presence, Lord Priors, Captain of the Popolo, and Gonfaloniere of Justice, magnificent and powerful gentlemen of the magnificent city of Siena, with every honor due, your least son and servant, Giorgio of Caffa in the east, 16 years old or less, entreats your magnificent lordships, and on his own account subjects himself, and says to your magnificent lordships, when about 10 years ago I was in the city of Caffa, and was with other boys on the shore, and a Genoese ship was in port, it sent a boat to land with several men, and secretly took me and another boy who was with me, about 10 years old. Then we raised anchor and went to Chios in the east. There I submitted, or indeed my masters assigned me, to one Lorenzo de Ricasole of Florence, with whom I stayed for about 4 years. Then Lorenzo, bankrupt, departed from Chios and went to sea for a while. Immediately after Lorenzo had left, all of his things were seized by his creditors. I remained with certain Genoese, with whom I stayed for about 3 years. Then, coming to Ancona with a Genoese ship, I submitted to another Genoese there. Staying thus in Ancona, by chance I found Lorenzo, to whom I offered myself many times if he wanted me to return to him. He always refused, saying that he didn't need my service. Now, I was here in our city, in Siena, and associated with the Guild of Shoemakers. By chance, Lorenzo arrived here, and he made me defend myself to the podestat, saying that I was his slave, a thing which is not true at all, and it's not possible to show anything to prove it. Whence, my lords, I commend myself to your magnificent lordships, and implore you, by God and by grace and by justice, that it ought to please you to provide that Christians may not be taken and sold in this your magnificent city, warning your lordships that in these days he tried to send me in a fortified transport to Talamone to sell me onto a galley. Your magnificent lordships know to what extent such things may be legal and just. So I encountered this story for the first time during my first semester in graduate school. I had applied to graduate school with the intention of studying trade across cultural boundaries in the medieval Mediterranean, specifically trade between Italy and some part of the Islamic world. But I hadn't quite worked out what aspect of trade I wanted to focus on. That fall, my advisor, Adam Costa, was team teaching a class on captivity with Evan Hayfully, who's a historian of early America. So I thought I'd better take that class. Adam was interested in the exchange of hostages in the context of medieval legal history as a form of pledge or surety, and Evan was interested in early American captivity narratives involving Native Americans. So it was a very interesting class, but I had to find a way to write a research paper that had something to do with the Mediterranean. And I had no idea at that point that slavery even existed in the medieval period, so I started searching to try to find primary sources related to slavery in Italy and the Islamic world, and this is one of the first sources that I found. I was really shocked by Giorgio's story for a couple of reasons. First, I couldn't believe that it was legal for Genoese sailors to enslave Genoese subjects. Caffa, which is the city where he was kidnapped, was a colony of Genoa during the 15th century, so how could Genoese sailors have just kidnapped and enslaved children from Caffa without facing any kind of consequences? Because of that, I also couldn't understand why Giorgio had waited so long to make a complaint, and I assumed that it was because he had been waiting for the opportunity to go to a court that was outside of the Genoese sphere. Finally, I was very frustrated that the surviving document didn't include the court's decision. What happened to Giorgio? Was he freed or not? Not knowing the answer and having it be forever inaccessible was really bothering me. So I wanted to learn more about the legal system in which this whole thing was taking place so that I could make some kind of educated guess about what the result might have been. The other discovery that bothered me during this early phase of research was a disconnect between the Italy-based literature and the Egypt-based literature about the medieval slave trade. I quickly learned that the major slave trading hubs in Italy were Genoa and Venice, and that the Mamluk state in Egypt and Syria also imported large numbers of slaves for military service. These military slaves were called Mamluks with a lowercase m, and at a certain stage in their training, they were systematically manumitted and allowed to hold positions of power. And that's why the state is called Mamluk with a capital M. But it was surprisingly difficult to find out who the slave traders were. The Italy-based scholarship emphasized the role of the Genoese without naming any individual names, and it presented them in a negative light as bad Christians who were both violating the natural anti-slavery stance of Christianity and undermining the Crusades by selling military slaves to the Mamluks on the side. This seems suspicious to me because when I read the Mamluk-based scholarship, I couldn't find any references to Genoese slave traders at all. Instead, they talked about people like Majd ad-Din as-Salami, who was a well-respected figure within Mamluk society. He was a diplomat who traveled between the Mamluk court, which you can see on the left side of this map, and the Ilkhanate, which is sort of the westernmost of these four Mongol states. As well as he was also a specialist trader in various kinds of luxury goods for the royal court, including but not limited to slaves. So I'm going to quote one of the early sources I found about him. This is a quote from a biographical dictionary, which is sort of a who's who that gives short biographies of people who the author considered to be important. This biographical dictionary was written by a Safadi in the 14th century, and it's called Ayana Asr wa Awana Nasr, which means notables of the age and servants of victory. But there's actually a pun in there because An-Nasr, the victorious, was the reign name of the sultan during the first part of the 14th century. But if you spell it with a short A sound instead of a long A sound, it means victory. So the last part of the title sort of hints at being servants of An-Nasr, the king, but literally it's servants of victory. And this is one of the fun things about working with Mamluk sources, is that the authors were very into puns and they're also very into rhyming titles. So there's lots of books with really clever, great titles. In any case, so this is one of some of what As-Safadi had to say about slave traders. Ismail ibn Mahmud ibn Yaqut as-Sadr al-Khwaja Majduddin al-Salami. So that's his name and all of his official titles. He was one of the private traders in the days of the king An-Nasr Muhammad ibn Qalawun, which is the king that was used to make the pun in the book title. He entered the country of the Tatars, traded and did business, and returned with slaves and other kinds of merchandise and wonders of the land. He worked hard with Juban, may God Almighty have mercy on him, until they reached a peace agreement between the king An-Nasr and the Khan Abu Sa'id, and that was organized through his mediation and the goodness of his policy. He possessed an abundant intelligence and contemplated goals that were interwoven, expert in the manners of kings and what befits their minds, skilled in presenting slaves and jewels to them. His speech was felicitous and his behavior far from deviation, beautiful in form, magnificent in appearance, shining like a lamp wick. He died, may God Almighty have mercy on him, on Wednesday, the 7th of Jumada al-Akhira in the year 743, which is 1343 CE. His birth was in the year 671, and he was buried with his grave located at Bab al-Nasr, the Gate of Victory in Cairo. So I summarized that a little bit for the sake of time, but if this is the kind of person who was known as a slave trader in the Mamluk primary sources and in scholarship that focuses on the medieval Middle East, then why were the Italy-based scholars so sure that the Genoese were the most important slave traders? This just didn't seem right to me. Of course, these questions were too complicated to address in a single semester, and I was very unsatisfied with the paper that I turned in at the end of that captivity class. But I was hooked on the topic, and I decided to continue working on it for my master's thesis and then for my dissertation. As I gathered more of the puzzle pieces and started putting them together, my ideas started to coalesce around two arguments, which ended up becoming the two halves of the book. The result was not a comparative history of slavery in medieval Italy and Egypt. Rather, I ended up arguing that the Genoese, the Venetians, and the Mamluks all participated in a common culture of slavery in the late medieval Mediterranean. While there were certain differences in their practices of slavery, I wanted to put the weight on their similarities because they had been usually studied by two different groups of people and the similarities were being neglected in that context. I also wanted to emphasize that the Genoese, the Venetians, and the Mamluks didn't have separate trade networks. Instead, they participated as partners and as competitors in a single trade network for slaves. In order to present an integrated picture of this network, I structured the book in two parts. The first half defined slavery as it was instituted in the late medieval Mediterranean and highlighted some of the elements of the common culture of slavery, with special emphasis on those that were related to trade in the market. In the second half, I emphasized the forces that shaped the slave trade, especially the role of states as opposed to merchants. I started the book by defining slavery within the specifically historical context of the Mediterranean in the 13th to 15th centuries. I posited the existence of a common culture of slavery that was shared by Christians, Muslims, and Jews, a culture in which slavery was legal and widely considered to be socially acceptable. Enslavement was seen as a universal threat that affected everyone in the region. Any person, regardless of their gender, age, class, or religious or political affiliation, could be vulnerable to enslavement if they found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tying this back to the story of Giorgio, it turned out that beaches were a dangerous place for children in the late Middle Ages because it was easy for kidnappers to snatch them and make a quick getaway. And Giorgio was not the only person to be captured on a beach, and even adults who were wandering around by the seaside had to be careful. How was all of this justified? According to medieval Mediterranean jurists, the legal basis of slave status was religious difference. People were not supposed to enslave adherents of the slave religion as themselves, so Christians were not supposed to enslave Christians, Muslims were not supposed to enslave Muslims, and Jews were not supposed to enslave Jews. Slaves were usually forced to convert to the religion of their masters after they'd become enslaved, but that kind of conversion didn't require manumission. So from that perspective, I was right to be shocked by the enslavement of Giorgio, not because he was a Genoese subject enslaved by other Genoese subjects, but because he presented himself as a Christian enslaved by Christians. To people living in the medieval Mediterranean, that would have raised questions about the legality of his status. If the authorities in Siena decided that Giorgio had been illegally enslaved because he was a Christian at the time when he was captured, then they might have chosen to accept his petition and grant him a judicial manumission. In the course of my research, I did find records of other enslaved people from Christian backgrounds, especially Greek Orthodox people who petitioned for freedom and were successful. There's just one problem with these records. Alongside the cases of the Greek slaves who were able to gain their freedom by proving their religious background, I also found cases of Russian, Bulgar, and other Orthodox slaves who were not freed, despite also having a Christian background. So in the second chapter, I talked about language and race as a shorthand for classifying people as enslavable or not enslavable, especially since religious belief was a difficult quality to prove in court. As an example of the significance of language, I'll mention the story of two Christian ships that arrived in Tunis in 1462 with a group of captives for ransom. A passing traveler from the Mamluk borderlands in eastern Anatolia, Abdelbasit ibn Khalil, visited the ships and found one captive who had not been ransomed by the Tunisians. He was, quote, an excellent Muslim of Turkish race, knowing only Turkish and the language of the Franks. Since Abdelbasit spoke Turkish as well as Arabic, he was able to speak first with the man in Turkish and then explain to the locals in Arabic that he was a Muslim. They then hurried to arrange a ransom and they apologized profusely for their mistake. By God, they said to me, we didn't know his language at all and we believed that he was an infidel. So in other words, because this man didn't speak Arabic, he wasn't recognized as a Muslim by fellow Muslims, and therefore he almost didn't get the protection that he should have had from permanent enslavement. Talking about race in the late medieval Mediterranean requires us to pause first and check some of our assumptions. Americans are used to thinking about slavery as a hierarchy of power built on a racial binary, white over black. This framework doesn't fit medieval Mediterranean slavery for several reasons. First, medieval Mediterranean slavery was justified primarily in terms of religious difference, which I've already talked about, as opposed to racial difference. Secondly, though, racial difference, when it did enter the conversation, was not perceived as binary in the late medieval period. And third, which I'll talk about just a little bit, racial differences were not necessarily articulated in terms of skin color, although skin color was one of the physical characteristics that might have racial associations. So for purposes of this discussion, I'm drawing on George Fredrickson's definition of race as a way of categorizing people based on their supposedly permanent, fixed, and inherent differences. Medieval ideas of racial difference, supposedly innate and permanent qualities that could be used to categorize and rank groups of people, were largely constructed through 4 disciplines: ethnography, which was the study of different kinds of people throughout the world; physiognomy, which was the study of physical traits associated with different qualities of personality and character; physiology, the study of the function of the human body; and astrology, the study of the effects of the heavenly bodies on earthly bodies. These genres were part of a shared medieval intellectual heritage. Treatises were written, translated, and exchanged among Christians, Muslims, and Jews throughout the medieval world. The ways these genres constructed racial difference was along a spectrum. The world was divided into 7 climes, and the environmental qualities of each clime were believed to affect the bodies and the temperaments of the people who were born there. The normative body, which was considered to be the best one and the most balanced, was located at the center in the 4th climate zone, and when geographers and ethnographers were writing about this, they always put themselves in the 4th climate zone, for obvious reasons. Monstrous bodies were associated with climatic imbalance in the far reaches of the earth. So from this viewpoint, racial difference wasn't binary, but it was a profusion that reflected the endlessly fertile creativity of God in nature. Yet, although the number of racial categories was potentially infinite, there were only certain ones that were associated with slavery. Medieval scholars who produced lists of enslavable people didn't necessarily agree about what races existed to be put into the list, or about which ones were enslavable and which ones were not, but the act of compiling a list demonstrated their belief that it was possible to divide all these potential infinite categories of humanity into 2 groups: enslavable and not enslavable. In Mamluk thinking, the idea of geographical extremes was the most important, and so the enslavable races tend to be grouped within the category of enslavable according to far north and far south. In Italian thinking, Aristotle's ideas about barbarians as natural slaves were also influential, and this directed Italians' attention especially to the Scythians, who were the inhabitants of the Black Sea during Aristotle's time. So, although skin color was sometimes mentioned in medieval discussions about the effect of climate on bodies, it wasn't a feature that could be used to differentiate enslavable people from not enslavable people. So it played a different role than we're used to in the American context. Moving on, I need to sketch out the demography of the enslaved population a little bit and the uses to which slaves were put in the late medieval Mediterranean. This is the third chapter. This marks a transition from the first argument about the common culture of slavery into the second argument about the structure of the slave trade. Muslims and Christians used their slaves for similar kinds of things with a few notable differences, and therefore the factors influencing the demand for slaves were fairly consistent across different parts of the Mediterranean. Generally speaking, in the late medieval Mediterranean, most households had no more than 2 slaves, the majority of whom were women, purchased in their teens or early 20s. In this sense, Giorgio was unusual just because he was a male. The most notable exception to these rules was the household of the Mamluk Sultan, which had thousands of enslaved men, women, children, and eunuchs. But the Sultan's household was unique because his extraordinary level of slave ownership was meant to reflect his wealth and power as a sovereign. Slave labor was not economically essential to medieval Mediterranean societies, but enslaved people still performed a variety of important functions. First and foremost, they were social and financial assets. As human beings, their presence in the household added to their master's prestige. Slave retinues were displayed to visitors and accompanied their masters in public. As objects, slaves' economic value was part of their master's wealth. Slaves could be bought and sold, used to make payment for other goods, given as a gift, rented, insured, or pledged as collateral against a loan. They could be inherited, they could be appraised, they could be stolen, they could be confiscated by the state, and they could form part of a woman's dowry. They could also be authorized to conduct trade on behalf of their masters. Day to day, most male and female slaves were employed in domestic service. So this is probably the kind of work that Giorgio was doing both in Chios and in Ancona. Domestic tasks included cooking, cleaning, washing and maintaining clothes and linens, carrying water, buying food, collecting firewood and tending the fire, spinning, sewing, weaving, running errands, caring for and nursing children, tending animals, and personal service of various kinds. The Mamluk state used male slaves for military service, and wealthy Mamluk notables used eunuchs to manage and to mediate between their parallel male and female households. Italians didn't purchase eunuchs, and they didn't expect military service from male slaves, so these are some of the areas where the common culture of slavery diverged a bit. Female slaves in both Italian and Mamluk households were subject to sexual and reproductive demands, as well as demands on their physical labor. This is an area where keeping the shared culture of slavery in mind reveals surprising insights. First, although historians have paid more attention to the sexual use of slave women in Islamic context, it was also very common and well documented in Christian contexts. Second, the most important difference between Islamic and Christian practices of slavery had to do with the children of the enslaved mothers. Under Christian and Roman law, children inherited the status of their mothers. So the child of a free man and an enslaved woman would be a slave. In contrast, under Islamic law, if a free man acknowledged paternity of his child by an enslaved woman, then the child was considered free and legitimate, and the woman gained a status called walad status, which meant, among other things, that she couldn't be sold and she would be automatically manumitted at the time when the man died. In the Islamic context, therefore, having sex with an enslaved woman usually produced heirs, whereas in the Christian context, it usually produced property. The third insight is that over the course of the 14th century, Christian practices regarding the children of enslaved women gradually moved closer to Islamic practices. Free Christian fathers started to acknowledge and claim their children by enslaved women in the late 14th century, and so a new aspect of the shared culture of slavery started to emerge during that period. In the next chapter, I focused on the locations and the operations of the major slave markets in Genoa, Venice, Cairo, and Alexandria. Although public slave markets were common across the late medieval Mediterranean, they didn't normally take the form of auctions. Instead, in the Islamic world, slaves were usually sold in a specialized market space, and this might be located in an open lot or a square. It could be a street with slaves standing or sitting along the sides, and that's what I'm showing here are these kind of spaces. Or an enclosed building called a khan or a funduk, which would have a central courtyard surrounded by shops on the first floor and then private rooms on the second floor. In Italy, in contrast, the average seller had only 1 or 2 slaves available at a time and would use a broker to make contact with potential buyers. Transactions sometimes took place in public spaces, such as the area behind the Rialto Bridge in Venice. And this is actually a really difficult area to get a picture of without people, so I went at like midnight on a rainy day in October and I got a picture without people in it. Or else at notaries' benches in the central business district in Genoa. But more often they took place in private houses and shops. Once a price had been set, the sale of a slave was usually formalized with a written contract in the presence of witnesses. The creation of written documents to mark their sale put slaves in the category of high-value goods alongside land, houses, ships, horses, jewels, and wholesale commodities. Among the more interesting clauses in these documents are consent clauses and health warranties, and I'll talk a little bit about each one. Genoese and Venetian warranties of good health use formulas like healthy in mind and body and in all her members, hidden and manifest, or healthy and clean from danger of all hidden flaws and illnesses up to the present day. In addition, slave buyers had a 1-month period of refusal during which the seller would automatically assume liability for any faults that were discovered in the slave. Mamluk contracts, however, tended to put the liability for fault on the buyer, and they were usually phrased with a clause where the buyer said that viewing, cognizance, and agreement in a legal manner had occurred. And the period of refusal there was set at only 3 days. So for this reason, Mamluk buyers had to take much more responsibility for investigating the health of slaves, and Mamluk physicians wrote a genre of texts, which I call slave buying advice manuals, to help non-expert buyers decide whether a particular enslaved person being offered for sale was in good health or not. These advice manuals are tremendously helpful for understanding how slave markets functioned in detail, and so I go into some detail about them in the book. Consent clauses are a feature unique to contracts for the sale of slaves. In this kind of clause, an enslaved person either acknowledged their status or consented to be sold, which is a legal act that only a slave could perform because they're the only type of commodity that is capable of also making a legal statement. These clauses had genuine weight. When given the opportunity, a slave could stop a sale by refusing to acknowledge their status or give consent, although this was risky and it usually resulted in severe physical punishment. Slaves who did acknowledge their status would be precluded from appealing for freedom later, so these clauses tended to be used in cases where the status of the person being sold was dubious. For example, if Giorgio had been sold immediately after being kidnapped, and if we had that contract, which we don't, his buyer would have been wise to ask for one of these consent clauses because the legality of his status was questionable, and he did go on to challenge it later. This is the kind of situation which these clauses are trying to prevent. How did free people from the Black Sea end up as slaves in Mediterranean markets? This is chapter 5 of the book. I'm shifting from the common culture of slavery to the mechanisms which govern the supply of slaves in the slave trade. The chief ways to make slaves in the Black Sea were either violent capture in wars or in kidnapping raids, as happened to Giorgio, or else the sale of children by their own relatives. Genoa and Venice competed for control over the major ports and the shipping routes in the Black Sea, just like they did in the Mediterranean, both because they wanted to give their merchants privileged access and because they wanted to claim taxation rights over trade. Slaves weren't the only valuable commodities that were traded in the Black Sea. There was also grain, honey, wax, fish, caviar, and luxury goods like spices and silk that were transported overland from China. The Mamluks weren't interested in colonizing the Black Sea, but because a steady supply of military slaves was essential to the security and the stability of their state, They cultivated alliances with the Byzantines and later the Ottomans, as well as the Golden Horde, which is the Mongol state that's based on the lower Volga, from whose territory many of these Black Sea slaves are being taken. Chapter 6, which is the heart of the book, goes towards my original research question about who the merchants were, who exported slaves. I found that the majority of people who sold slaves in the late medieval Mediterranean didn't specialize in the slave trade, didn't handle slaves in large numbers, and weren't identified in any textual source as slave traders. There are some exceptions that are associated with the Mamluk court, and Majd ad-Din as-Salami is one of them. But even he combined his slaving activities with diplomacy, and he didn't make it a full-time career. As it turns out, this pattern of combining trade and slave trade and diplomacy was common to many of the elite Mamluk slave traders. There were no companies or institutions devoted to organizing the slave trade, there were no specialists in slave shipment, and there were no ships designed expressly for the purpose of transporting slaves. Instead, merchants who participated in the slave trade tended to do it opportunistically, buying some slaves for their own use, or for their family members, or for their business partners, and then maybe a couple more for sale. They tended to transport them on mixed cargo ships, along with all kinds of other Black Sea commodities, and they frequently bought and sold slaves at various stops along the way. Nevertheless, their combined efforts resulted in the export of thousands of slaves from the Black Sea every year. Interestingly, despite the narrative about the Genoese slave traders as bad Christians that I encountered early on in the secondary scholarship, medieval authors didn't describe the slave trade as being inherently wrong or evil. Medieval authorities didn't try to restrict or abolish it on moral grounds. To the contrary, they encouraged it through treaties, laws, and commercial privileges, and then they reaped the benefits by taxing it. The problem they encountered was that the slave trade was chaotic. As the Venetian Senate noted in frustration when they tried to pass regulations on the number of slaves per ship in the wake of a major slave revolt, quote, "It's known that the captains and men of the ships who sail to the regions of Tanna don't have any intention of observing the aim of the land or their own health." Trying to grasp the structure of this kind of unstructured trade may seem pointless, but the key is that all of the merchants who traded in slaves, however independently or infrequently, had to operate within certain constraints. These ranged from the seasonally prevailing winds to the location of the resupply stations for food and water along the way, but the most important is the political geography. States that controlled strategic points along the Black Sea trade routes were able to regulate the passage of slaves. Most obviously, whoever held the Bosphorus could regulate the shipment of slaves between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. So that's first the Byzantines and later the Ottomans. Through a combination of force and legislation, Genoa made Caffa a shipping hub for the entire Black Sea for all commodities, and thus that was another strategic point for regulating the slave trade specifically. Control of the borderlands between Anatolia and Syria was also essential for regulating the Mamluk slave trade by land. Once these kinds of constraints are identified, it becomes easier to recognize the patterns of choice in the actions of individual merchants. These patterns were shaped by political geography, and as I explained in the final chapter, they had political consequences. In the highly charged atmosphere of the late medieval Mediterranean, the religious aspect of the Black Sea slave trade became inextricably linked with the Crusade movement. The resounding success of Mamluk soldiers against Crusade armies, as well as competition between Christianity and Islam for control over the souls of slaves, led Christian Crusade theorists to propose an embargo against the Mamluks in the Eastern Mediterranean. Slaves were one of the commodities that was supposed to be embargoed, although the papacy was relatively late to add them to its official lists of banned goods. In the case of the slave trade, the failure of the embargo was not because of apathy or corruption on the part of maritime Christian powers like Genoa or Venice. In part, it was a matter of logistics. Setting aside a brief period in the early 14th century when the Anatolian-Syrian border was impassable, Italian ship captains never had a monopoly on Mamluk access to the Black Sea. In the late 13th century, Mamluk merchants used their own ships. By the mid-14th century, Mamluk merchants were traveling along the land route through Anatolia as well as the sea route through the Bosphorus, which the Genoese and the Venetians did control. Yet, even to the extent that Genoa and Venice could control the Mamluk slave trade, they were more interested in restricting it than in stopping it. Italian control over the Black Sea ports in the late 14th and early 15th century was counterbalanced by Mamluk control over the spice trade at Alexandria. And since Genoa and Venice were not willing to withdraw their merchants from Alexandria or give up their commercial privileges in the spice trade, they couldn't refuse the Mamluk state's demand for slaves. This made the Crusade theorists angry, and this is where the narrative of the Genoese as the bad Christians comes from. Because scholars who focused on slavery in medieval Italy looked only at the descriptions of the Mamluk slave trade by the Crusade theorists who were writing in Latin, and not the descriptions of the Mamluk slave trade by the Mamluks who were writing in Arabic, they misunderstood the relative significance of Genoese traders in the overall Black Sea slave trade. So having reached the end of this book project, I came to see it from a new angle. So if you ask me today what I learned, I would emphasize the methodological challenge of deciding in what ways and to what extent a historian should try to impose order on a fundamentally disorderly system in order to try to explain it. So in this book, I tried to explain a fundamentally disorganized trade network in a way that would make sense to readers without creating a false impression of order where there wasn't really any order. What I'd like to do next is to try to explain the fundamental disorder in the legal concept of enslavability. The notion of religious difference as the basis of enslavability is what the medieval jurists said was important, but it doesn't reflect how they actually made decisions about slave status. And so this is where we need to go back to the story of Giorgio. And this time I'm going to give you the whole text since it's been a little while. So at first glance, Giorgio's enslavement seems obviously illegal by the standards of his time. But now that we've learned a little bit more about the context in the process of going through this book, I'm not so sure. There's a different set of details that stands out to me now, details that reveal the malleability and the situational nature of law in relation to slavery. I'm interested now in how Giorgio used law and legal procedure and manipulated the judge's assumptions to make the strongest possible case for his freedom in a situation that was actually very murky. First, it's relevant that Giorgio chose to challenge his status only after 10 years and 3 different masters. There's a number of reasons why he probably waited so long. First, there's the matter of his capacity to bring a lawsuit. In 1460, when Giorgio appeared before the court in Siena, he was about 16, which was not the age of full majority, which was 25, but it was old enough to undertake binding legal acts like swearing oaths and making contracts. You're old enough to join a monastery, you're old enough to get married, all the other sort of binding commitments one could make. During his time as a slave in Chios and Ancona, he had been a minor. He was younger than 14, and therefore he was too young to initiate a legal act, either to petition for freedom or to designate someone else to represent him. In addition, since he was only 6 when he was kidnapped, he might not have been aware of the laws which explicitly ban the enslavement of Genoese colonial subjects in Caffa, and therefore he might not have realized that he actually had a stronger case for freedom in a Genoese court than he did in Siena. In other words, as an enslaved minor, Giorgio faced barriers to challenging his status that didn't affect those over the age of 14. By the time he was old enough to overcome those barriers, he'd also been enslaved long enough that it was difficult to make his challenge convincing. In order to counter the argument that Giorgio should remain enslaved because he'd already been enslaved for 10 years, Giorgio or his representative were very careful about the wording of this petition. At every point, he was very careful not to reify his status. He referred to himself as a son and free servant, and the word he uses is servidore and not schiavo, of the city of Siena, and he mentioned his participation in the local shoemakers guild as a way to sort of claim a place in free society. The word slave, schiavo, appears only in the mouth of Lorenzo, who was trying to claim him, and it's being presented as a claim that Lorenzo needs to prove. This strategy is most obvious in the sections where Giorgio has to describe his de facto enslavement. At first in Chios, he says, "I submitted, or indeed my masters bestowed me." And later in Ancona, he says, "I submitted to another Genoese." This phrasing preserves Giorgio's agency even at the moments when he's losing it. So by presenting submission as his choice, first at age 6 and then again at age 13, he's trying to maintain his right to choose again and to choose differently now that he's 16. How did Giorgio plan to prove his case? The documentary record of his status seems to have been thin. His initial kidnapping was definitely not documented because it was illegal. His subsequent sales and movements may or may not have been recorded, and if they were, the records would have identified him as a slave, so displaying them to the court would only have undermined his case. The most interesting question is how Giorgio got from Ancona to Siena. If his Genoese master in Ancona had manumitted him, that would definitely have been recorded, and Giorgio would have had a copy, and he would have had every reason to show that to the court. Instead, he glossed over this part of his story. He doesn't talk about how he gets from Ancona to Siena, he just kind of drops it in there. So that suggests that he might have run away to get to Siena and tried to build a new life there as a shoemaker, only to have his past suddenly come back to haunt him. In order to dodge questions about the move from Ancona to Siena, Giorgio framed the petition to put the burden of proof as much as possible on Lorenzo. He argued that Lorenzo's claim is not true at all and it's not possible to show anything to prove it. By making this rhetorical move, he's sidestepping the fact that he also had very little evidence to prove that he was free. Finally, it's not surprising, given what we know about religion and enslavability, that Giorgio claimed freedom through this rhetorical appeal to God, grace, and justice. But Giorgio never directly identified himself as a Christian. And it's notable that the phrase that he used to describe himself, Georgia of Kaffa in the East, says nothing about his parents, his ethnicity, his language, his original religion, or the racial category to which his previous owners had assigned him. Kaffa was a very diverse place, and the possibilities for his family background are vast. We have no idea whether Giorgio was his original name. It was a common name both for free Italian men, and it was also a common baptismal name for previously non-Christian slaves in Italy. But it's especially surprising that Giorgio didn't name his father, because that was typically how free people were identified in legal documents. So this suggests that there might have been something about his background that Giorgio wanted to hide, something that could have been used to classify him as an enslavable person, even though he was a colonial subject from Kaffa. I wanted to return to this example to show that what seems to be a clear-cut legal case with an obvious resolution was not clear-cut after all. Giorgio had been prevented from challenging his status at the time when he was first enslaved because at that point he was too young. He probably didn't have the knowledge to make a successful petition for freedom, and even if he did, he didn't have the legal capacity. By the time he was old enough, the written evidence was already stacked against him. He may have been a fugitive from a previous master, and he may also have realized that his family background made him enslavable, even though as a Genoese colonial subject, he should have been protected. Giorgio needed to either conceal or distract the court from all of these factors working against him in order to get a judgment in his favor. So the legal basis of slavery and the legal procedures used to determine how slave status applied to individual cases was less orderly than it might appear. And unlike the merchants, who acted in disorderly ways but they kept records of it, the judges and notaries and the other parties to these cases found that it was in their interest to manipulate the written records to conceal just how disorderly their actions were. So making sense of this new kind of disorder is the challenge that I'm looking forward to. Thank you. What? Okay, here we go.
Thank you, everyone. Before we take questions, I just want to make a small couple of announcements. The first is to thank Lauren Whitby and Barbara Dente for their outstanding work on this event, and I really want to thank them. They've put so much work into it. Round of applause, I think, for that. There is also food and drinks afterwards. The food is excellent, and for those of you online, you're really missing out. It not only looks beautiful, it tastes beautiful. And there's a 15% discount on any of the books for sale tonight by the bookstore, so thank you. Has anyone got any questions for Hannah?
Shall I turn this back on?
Hannah, could you go back, I mean, I appreciate that you're focusing on the story of Giorgio, but could you talk about gender and slavery a little bit more, particularly how, at least as I understand from your book, we're really talking about a trade that's built, at least in the Christian Mediterranean, based around the enslavement of women?
Right, and this sort of goes to the connection between slavery and the domestic labor and the sexual labor, and these things are all kind of connected. So when you're looking at it in the Christian context, a lot of these enslaved women are owned either by men who are not married or widowers who are not going to cook their own dinner. And their choice is either to get a free servant to do it, which was an option, right? There are also free servants who do this kind of work, or a slave, but if you get a slave, then you also have sexual rights over her body. And so, and then there's also the status that's attached to it, associated with owning a slave rather than hiring a free servant. So that's one of the reasons why women are preferred. When you're looking at the Islamic context, there's less of a culture of free women working as servants because it's considered to be dishonorable to be working alone as a woman in someone else's house. So women who are slaves are preferred for this kind of a work because the honor issues, they're not considered socially to have honor. So the fact that they're working in someone else's house is not anything that anyone cares about. So that's sort of the demand side. On the supply side, where are these slaves coming from? They're captives that are being taken in wars and raids. What happens when you go and raid someone's village? You kill all the men and you take the women and children, right? So there are more women being enslaved because of the mechanisms for creating slaves. And then there's also more demand for women as well because of the kind of work that they're being asked to do. There are these exceptional cases like the military slaves. So there is demand for male slaves, but broadly speaking across the whole Mediterranean, women are being preferred as slaves. So there's this really strong gender skew towards women in the slave population. And Genoa is actually particularly extreme, just in terms of the statistics that I was able to compile. There are decades where it's 80 or 90% female slaves in Genoa. It's a little bit more balanced in places like Venice and Barcelona and Cairo. But Genoa in particular, it's all female slaves all the time. So in that sense, Giorgio is kind of an exception because he does seem to be doing this kind of domestic work, taking care of the house, things that are gendered female, even though he's a male slave who's doing it. But that's actually the exception rather than the rule. Thanks.
I was really interested in your focus on sort of state structural support. And I was wondering to what degree, because you're talking about it as shared culture.
Right.
And so to what degree does it depend upon historical roots or historical practices, or does it sort of arise with the states? I was just interested in where it comes from.
So there is sort of a continuous tradition of slavery in the Mediterranean period that goes back as far as you want to push it, right? Mm-hmm. So there is some question about how much of this is a shared tradition, how much of it is about influence and interaction, and then how much of it is about parallel evolution. People faced with similar problems come up with similar solutions. And I think the answer is all of the above, depending on particularly which practice we're looking at. I think the consent clauses, for example, in the contracts, I think that's a parallel evolution thing. I don't think Mamluk jurists are looking at Italian contracts or vice versa to come up with this model. I think they come up with that solution independently. But especially this issue about the status of the children of enslaved women by free men. I think that's a question of influence, and I think the people who are driving the influence are the slaves, right? That there are enslaved women who are coming from societies where they expect that if they have a child with their enslaver, that they're going to receive certain privileges, and their children definitely should receive certain privileges. And then they find out that that's not the case, and they protest in various ways. The shift really happens when it starts to become in the father's interest also for the children to have status and to have privileges and to have freedom, because they're the ones who have the power to make the choice. But I do think that there's a question of influence there. And it's not just in the Islamic world, by the way. I've been looking at Russian legal codes also, and it turns out that according to the Ruskaya Pravda, right, the children of an enslaved woman and a free man should be free after his death. So I think there's pressure coming from various directions, and it's not just a Mediterranean thing. There's actually a bigger picture of this. And then there are certain areas where they're drawing on common traditions. I mean, all this stuff about the 7 climes and everything, this is going back to Galen and Hippocrates, and that's being sort of taken in different directions, but there's this broader medical and geographical and physiognomic and I mean, all of these categories, right? They're all part of the same discourse, even though you have individual authors who have their individual takes on it. So it's kind of all of the above. Does that answer your question?
Very much so, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Were there ever any organized slave raids as opposed to sort
Yeah.
of from military action?
Yeah.
Would they be coming from the merchants that would be organizing, or were there slave traders that was basically all they did?
So the merchants are not organizing raids, soldiers are organizing raids. Because this is how they get paid, right? Well, I mean, soldiers get a salary, maybe, but the other way that they get paid is by looting and then selling whatever they can take. And the loot can include, you know, sheep and cows, and the loot can include gold and silver, and the loot can include people. And so when you see organized slave raiding, it tends to be soldiers in between wars who are not satisfied with their base salary, right? And they're looking for other ways to make money, and this is one of the relatively easy ways for them to make money. So there are specific examples of that from different parts of the Black Sea. One of the really interesting ones is there's a crusade in the mid-15th century, the Crusade of Varna, that's in sort of Eastern Europe, and so there's a naval component to this. So you have these Burgundian crusading ships coming into the Black Sea, and they're going to go up the river to get to Varna, and they run out of money. So what do? They kidnap about 400 people off the shore, and they take them to Trebizond, and they sell them, and that's how they get the money to get supplies before they're going to go up the Danube to engage in the crusade. So the Burgundians are not normally part of this story. That's sort of a Western European thing, but it's interesting that they know exactly what to do, right? How to make money in this region. So there is a lot of organized slave raiding, and it's kind of going in every direction. This is part of the fact that the idea of the universal threat, right? That if you are the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time and the wrong ship shows up, too bad for you. One of the things I didn't really get into but is interesting is that Genoese and Venetians and Mamluks, for that matter, are victims of this as well. So you have people from Venetian patrician families who are in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they get captured in a battle, and that's it. They're done, you know. And they're not dead, but perhaps nobody was able to pay the ransom, and so they get sold, and you never hear from them again. So there are certain groups that are preying more on other groups at any given time. You can talk about sort of a shifting balance of power, but there's no one who's completely free from this threat. Thanks.
You showed an image depicting a slave on a door.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you could talk about that a little more, its significance and meaning. Yeah.
So actually I can't, because this is one that I just found and I need to do more looking into it.
Oh.
Basically what happened is after the last time I went to Genoa, so I think the last time I went to Genoa was in 2017, and in 2018 the archive did an exhibition about slavery in Genoa, which I wasn't able to go and see. So I have a copy of the catalog, and they had this image in the catalog, and I thought that's really cool. But I haven't had a chance to either go look at the building and see what else is on that doorway, or where it's located in the city. I mean, I had the address, right? But I need to go look at the building and see what the deal is. And I also kind of want to talk to the archivist, and I was going to wait until I had a chance to go there and do that in person, and then of course that hasn't been possible. I was going to go in 2020, and you know. So sooner or later, I'm going to go there and find out more about this. It is potentially interesting to have the slave in this position as in the doorway, as the mediator between the interior and the exterior of the house, if the slaves are supposed to be the ones who are going out and running all the errands. There's part of the errands that are about just sort of doing the heavy work, right? But it's also considered to be, in Italian cities, right? It's sort of a low status thing to be one of the people who goes to the well and hangs out with all the other low class people around the well and gossips and everything like that. So free women from noble families are not out and about wandering around the city in that way. So there is something there about slaves as sort of this connection between the interior and the exterior of the house. But I don't want to push that too far until I have a chance to look more into this. So.
No problem.
Yeah.
I actually have another question.
Okay.
So you talked about this being a very complicated problem to solve, and certainly complicated to research. And I was just curious about your motivation. Like, there are obviously easier things you could have studied and written about. There are things you could write about that don't require you to learn so many languages and go so many different competing places. And I'm just curious why you chose it and why you stuck with it, because it is kind of complicated.
I think at first I was really interested in it as a puzzle. That it was a complicated puzzle, and every piece of it that I found made me more baffled. And so I just needed to know. I needed to understand how all these things fit together because I just couldn't see it. So part of it was because it was challenging, that also made it fun. But then there are various aspects of it that they've just taken me in areas that I never even knew I was interested in, and then the more I learn about it, the more interested I discover I am. The connection between the way slave markets work in medicine and ideas about the body, and how there's this whole genre of slave inspection manuals in the Mamluk context, but then how do people do that in Italy if there's no written genre? So part of it is about the way the warranties are constructed, but then it turns out there's also a whole genre of legal cases where people have purchased a slave, and then after the period of refusal is over, they discover that they have epilepsy or something like that. So then there's a court case, and physicians get involved as expert witnesses. And I would never have gotten anywhere near that topic without having this comparative perspective. Just the fact that it's in some ways it's the same thing, but on the other hand, the way it's documented in Mamluk society and in Italian society is so different. And that's just kind of fun, being able to go back and forth between the two and see which things are sort of obvious from one perspective that are not obvious at all from the other perspective, and then which things are obvious from this perspective but are really, really difficult to answer from the other perspective. And it's also a part of history that just hasn't gotten a lot of attention. It is actually much better documented than I thought. It was confusing at the beginning because the historiography was all over the place. But once I went to the archives, there was a lot of material. And it's really interesting, it's really engaging. The people who are involved with all of this are absolutely fascinating people. And I think especially, the other thing I've become more and more interested in as I learn more about this is the questions of sources that represent slaves' voices. It's relatively difficult to find anything that was written by a slave, like with their own hands personally, but there's a lot of this material that's testimony. And there hasn't been a lot of attention to that in the historiography because people who are looking at this from a very narrow perspective will say, well, we just don't have a lot of information about slavery in general. There's really nothing that's written by slaves, but actually there is. There's a huge amount of information. But you have to go to the archives and really dig a little bit to find it. So it's just, it's rich. I feel like the more I put into it, the more I get out. And that makes me want to keep working on it because I keep finding these really interesting stories that are a footnote somewhere in somebody else's book, but you could write a whole article just about this footnote, right? So that's exciting and that's fun and makes it easy to want to keep working on this and keep pushing it in different directions.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy the food.
Thank you.
All right, that's a great overview and intriguing story.